welcome to my video. My name is Cami and I'm a chronically online college student. This video is for my Philosophy 8 class. This course explores the world's major religions and their origins, history, and significant ideas. This is my alternative assignment for Module 6, where we discuss Confucianism. As always, I will list all my sources in the description below. I had minimal knowledge of Confucianism before starting last week's module. I understood who Confucius was, but only through a popular meme format, like these. The first time I asked why these memes were supposed to be funny, I was told Confucius was a Chinese philosopher. But because of the nature of the internet and other silly urban legends I had once believed, I'd maintained a skeptical assumption that Confucius was just a fictional character, created solely for the purpose of this meme. But I learned this week that he was in fact a real historical person. He was a philosopher and a politician, and he was born in what is now the modern Shantung province. Because his father was in the military, Confucius received a very intense and well-rounded education. This earned him a place as what Dr. Glorian explains as, quote, a member of a class called Ru, who were specialists in the 6 arts: ceremonial, music, archery, charioteering, history, and numbers, end quote. He later gained employment as an advisor to a prince. Even though he had this immense knowledge and training, working with the prince was challenging for him. It was alleged that he was facing this challenge because, quote, he was critical of the injustice and lack of proper conduct in the courts, end quote. My connection may seem off the walls, but stay with me. I will do my best to make it make sense. At one point, I was staying in Venice Beach, sleeping on the sidewalk, for the experience, if you will. And I was spending my days on the gazebos on Dudley Avenue, which a funny kind of double connection is that we called these areas the pagodas because of the similarity in design to the religious buildings. Anyway, at one point while I was down there, I thought I'd try working at one of the many t-shirt stores that littered the boardwalk. I ended up quitting midway through my first official day, and the reason I quit was because of an answer I received when I had asked my manager, why were we so secretive about our prices? There was a policy that was explained to me late in my training that unless the customer specifically asked for the price of an item, you weren't supposed to tell them or give them any comparison. Essentially, the answer was that the store's goal was to get people to spend an exorbitant amount of money on a t-shirt that didn't really cost very much to make, without them really knowing until they swiped their credit card how much they were going to be paying. And the thought of being a part of that kind of made my stomach turn. So I walked out because, like I said, it just felt off. It felt dishonest and greedy. And I can understand wanting to make a profit, but not in a dishonest way like that. And granted, I was 19 and much more naive then, and my experiences working in lots of other corporate jobs have been similar, which makes me sometimes wish I'd stuck through with that original job. Maybe it would have done me a little bit of good in making an adjustment to real world jobs. But then again, maybe it was a good choice to walk away at that time, to prove to myself, at least, that if nothing else, I had an ethical and moral code I would adhere to as an egotistical 19-year-old. Confucius taught many things, and some of these teachings were recorded to become Analects. Some of his teachings included, as Dr. Glorian tells us, quote, things were better in the world in the distant past. The best way to bring harmony to the current problem of society was to restore these past glories. The best way to do this was to adjust relationships to reflect the way relationships were conceived in the past. So, to do that, Confucius promoted the learning of the Chinese classics, end quote. To me, this belief seems similar to Hinduism and Native American beliefs, that things were better in the past, and by living in ways that we did in the past, like ancestrism or rituals, that we're better off spiritually. And I found it interesting as well to learn that all of this relates to the notion that the reason we study the humanities like philosophy and literature is because, quote, they make us more human, end quote. So thanks, Confucius. Without your contributions, I wouldn't necessarily be able to learn about you or any other great ancient thinkers who have influenced the world that we live in today. When Dr. Glorian shared that Confucian followers prescribed their teachings of Confucius himself to the required classical education, along with many other teachings, and that you couldn't graduate until you were a master of these works and that it was clear that you fully understood them, I instantly thought of my cousin Sinjin, who, for as long as I can remember, has always had a love and an interest in theology and philosophy. And he loved theology so much that at one point he enrolled in seminary. But later he dropped out after realizing that the amount of studying one specific belief system would kind of ruin his fascination and wonder of the overall topic. And I think he would have really enjoyed this class, and especially Dr. Glorian's essays, a lot. Maybe he would have chosen a field similar to what this course studies had he taken one. Now, it's important to remember that even though Confucius was famous and highly respected, this wasn't just because he had come up with new ideas and shared them. Dr. Glorian says it was because he could, quote, absorb the classics himself and then teach the importance of character formation and the proper setup of important relationships, end quote. This reminds me of the Buddha, who was loved and respected because he did so much of these same things. Confucius was so esteemed because he walked the walk and could model the qualities that Confucians would continue to teach, end quote. This makes sense to me because the people I hold in the highest regard are the people who have, as I say, done the damn thing. People like my boyfriend, who decided to better his life and change career paths. He told me he wanted to join the Navy last February, and by the end of that week, he was in the recruiter's office. By April, he was off to boot camp. And just last week, after months of A school and real-world practice, he is officially a radar-qualified air traffic controller. I'm so incredibly proud of him. He said he wanted to do something, he put his mind to it, and he did the damn thing. I strive to be a person like him, a person like this in general, and I'm actively on my own path to do the same. I'm not joining the military because my path is different than his, similar to what most of these religions have taught us. Still, it's following a similar trajectory, just in a different time frame and career direction. I decided in May 2021 that I wanted to go to college because I wanted to be an American Sign Language English interpreter. By August, I started my first semester of classes, and as of this May, I will be transferring to my equivalent of A school for my training, which also includes real-world practice. So, like I said, it makes perfect sense that people will see these influential teachers who have chosen and committed to a path and continue to follow it and then feel drawn to them and look up to them as role models. Much like how the 6 arts that Confucius practiced in his early life later became a part of the classical Confucian education plan. Alongside Confucius's teachings and many other works, they did this so that they could resemble him and his behavior. This idea also relates to Confucius's belief that being virtuous has its own reward due to its positive influence on others, which again reminds me of the Buddha and his idea that by sharing, you further reach your liberation. The fundamentals of the Confucian tradition are based on what kind of resembles a caste system, similar to Hinduism. Dr. Glorian explains that this system said that, quote, people need to play their part and not someone else's part in order for society to function as well as possible. Confucius asked people to be what they are, end quote. What Confucius means by this is that if you're given a role, you do what you can to succeed in that role. If you're a son, be a good son. If you're a sister, be a good sister. If you're a painter, be a good painter. Because of this, quote, you did not have to leave and join a monastery or something similar. You just had to do the best you could with the position you found yourself in, end quote. And in a way, that's concerning, but it's also kind of comforting, right? Similar to in Native American beliefs, where everybody has their role, and in Hindu beliefs where everybody has their dharma, it can have both a lot of benefits and its fair share of challenges. But it's important to look at both of them and weigh the two against each other. Because, like I said, some aspects of it can bring great comfort, while others can cause need for concern and further introspection or exploration. Confucius also taught that we must be motivated by, quote, virtue or ren, a typically vague but eloquent term suggesting suggestive of humanity, love, high principle, and living together in harmony, end quote. I don't know about you, but that's something I can get on board with. Confucius believed we could practice this virtue best in society and through interpersonal relationships in order to learn Li. Dr. Glorian explains that Confucius said, quote, "A country would be well governed when all the parties performed in their parts aright in these relationships," end quote. Dr. Glorian explains that these 5 relationships are father-child, ruler-subject, husband-wife, elder brother, younger brother, and friend-friend. He also said, "The way we treat our parents reveals our character and how we treat others." This made me instantly think of one of the biggest red flags I saw when I was dating. Men, and people in general, who disrespected their mothers, especially if they did it in front of me. It told me that they have absolutely no care or respect for the woman who raised them, which inherently made me then question if they would have any respect for me. So, pro tip to anybody single out there, a good thing to look out for, according to Cami and Confucius, is how your potential partner treats their parents. Dr. Glorian reveals that, quote, "We now can confirm from modern psychological studies some of the wisdom of this Confucian position. To fix a newer relationship, we often have to go back to the originating issues and heal them there. I understand this. After a long cycle of toxic and sometimes abusive relationships, both romantically and in my friendships, I took a few months to repair my relationship with myself first. I did some serious self-reflection and I broke down why I kept allowing myself to get swept into these toxic cycles. Once I was able to identify the root issue and begin addressing it, I was able to begin developing happy and healthy relationships with myself, and in turn, happy and healthy relationships with my family and friends that were worthwhile." Dr. Glorian also makes note, quote, "While we have to broaden our view today, we can still take away the importance of having healthy relationships in the family if we want to have healthy relationships with the larger world," end quote. I completely agree, and I think this relates to something Dr. Glorian mentioned in one of our first academic modules, and that he's mentioned throughout. We need to examine these belief systems through the lens of the original period and through the lens of today's belief systems in order to understand these sometimes long-held viewpoints and analyze why some of these ideas haven't stood up the test of time. Before discussing women's roles in Confucianism, I think it's important to talk about yin and yang a little bit more. I briefly touched on it last week when I had mentioned that yin represents feminine energies and yang represents masculine energies, but it's a bit more complex than that, so I'm going to dive just a little bit deeper. The idea of yin and yang comes originally from the separation in ideas between monists, who see reality as made up of one substance, and the dualists, who see reality as divided into two, matter and spirit. Dr. Glorian explains, quote, "The Chinese talk about two, yin and yang, but the two are not opposed as in duality, but complementary as in polarity. What we experience as evil is not real, but a result of the lack of balance between yin and yang forces," end quote. So if I'm understanding correctly, what this means is that yin and yang coexist in all things, male and female, inanimate and animate, and when there's unbalanced energy between these two things, that's where discord thrives. A woman's role in classical Confucianism was primarily focused on her family and her private circles. As Dr. Glorian explains, quote, "This was so strongly enforced that sometimes the women were kept in inner apartments of homes and not allowed into the more public rooms where the men conversed and did business." Great. So like Harry Potter and the Dursleys? But, I mean, on the other hand, I suppose one could argue that these women must have been okay with this role because it meant that she was following the teachings of Ren and Li. She's fulfilling her Ren when she centers herself in the way that her society dictates, even if it means being virtually enslaved to her mother-in-law and needed most to produce sons. I may not like these practices or understand them based on my own modern understanding of patriarchy and feminist theory, but this is exactly why Dr. Glorian stresses the importance of remembering the period of these practices versus now. Dr. Glorian does go on to explain that these women weren't hated despite their societal roles, and that, quote, "They were simply seen as in a subordinate role and expected to play this role as well as possible," end quote. I don't truly understand why I'm so upset, because we see these values and roles in today's fundamentalist beliefs and even in some secular and insular communities. I mean, This idea is something I can connect to my own religious trauma. Being a woman in the Catholic Church is not the easiest thing to contend with. You are taught these similar messages that a woman's role is subordinate to her father or her husband. And before that, you're told that Eve was the corrupter of humankind, and therefore all women were inherently more sinful and lower ranking in the hierarchy than men. Essentially, it's a patriarchal viewpoint, but as we've seen in some societies, this can work, while in others it can be a source of trauma. I think it's all about the perspective in which you look at these things. When reflecting on Confucianism, the challenges are immediately noticed. Dr. Glorin explains, quote, "Confucianism offers a way of life that can bring about harmony by helping people find their proper roles and then encouraging them, but this system can quickly become too rigid, as the caste system in India did. Great injustices can be perpetuated by a system that doesn't allow protest, and people sometimes felt that suicide was their only option for escaping such a horrible situation," end quote. I hate the fact that I relate to that last sentence, but I did feel this way when I was 14 and living alone with my father in an abusive situation and having harmful messages being forced upon me, not only by him, but also by my teachers in the Catholic Church. So based on everything I was being told and taught, I believed that I was destined to go to hell when I died, regardless of when that was. So if that was the case, and I was determined to spend an eternity there, I may as well just end my life and get to hell sooner in order to face my fate. As I've gotten older though, and I've deconstructed and reflected upon my religious beliefs or my spiritual beliefs versus the beliefs I was taught as a child, I've been able to, in a way, come to grips with the fact that if that is what's going to happen, it is not going to stop me from living my very best life for as long as I can. And that's that, man.
With the help of personality tests, counselors, and self-help books, we seem to have totally figured out who we are. Some people even fetishize their newly found personality type, as they fully identify themselves with it, to a point that they cling to it. Unfortunately, this enchains them to a very limited view of who they are.
I've taken the Myers-Briggs personality test 5 times over the years, and I've gotten 5 different results. I'd be willing to wager that if I retook it right now, I'd get another different result. And is this because I have multiple personalities? No, it's because who I am as a person, my morals, beliefs, attitudes, and behavior patterns have changed and evolved as I've grown into a more developed person. If I believed wholeheartedly and identified myself based on one of these past test results, I could have limited my intellectual and spiritual potential, and what a waste that would have been. Labels are for soup cans and loaves of bread, not for human beings as ever-changing as we are. It seems like a disservice to limit yourself to just a label, because a label is a word, and just like we learned last week, a word is a symbol. It isn't real. This idea of not limiting yourself to just a label is something my mom helped me to understand early on. When discussing my personal or cultural identity now, I will share certain aspects, but I will always add the caveat that these things are the least important aspects of what make me who I am. But I also understand we live in a world where many people, especially those who've been disenfranchised, find comfort and self-satisfaction by having, sharing, and identifying with these labels. So I want to be sure I don't minimize their voice or disregard their position. But I think it's important to recognize, even if you are a member of one of these groups, that these identities, even though they can cause some self-contentment and self-reassurance, they can also be limiting in the way that we and others view ourselves.
We should be obedient to honourable people. Modern society is very egalitarian. We believe that we're all born equal and should ultimately be able to say and do whatever we like. We reject many rigid hierarchical roles. Yet Confucius told his followers, "Let the ruler be a ruler, the subject a subject, a father, and the son a son." This might sound jarring, but it is in fact important to realise that there are people worthy of our deep veneration, even our simple and humble obedience. We need to be modest enough to recognise the people whose experience or accomplishments outweigh our own. We should also practice peaceably doing what these people need, ask or command. Confucius explained, "The relation between superiors and inferiors is like that between the wind and the grass. The grass must bend when the wind blows across it."
I a skeptical attitude towards this from the beginning, and after watching, I can get on board with the overall line of thought, but now I just have a question. Conversely to this rule, does that mean that it's my ethical and moral obligation to disobey or disrespect those in hierarchical positions that are dishonorable? If so, where's the line? What behavior marks dishonorable versus honorable, and what treatment does each receive? Like the curious cat I am, I searched for an answer, and unfortunately I couldn't find one that made sense in regard to the question that I asked. So I did something I never thought I would do for an academic assignment, and I asked ChatGPT. This is what happened.
What does Confucius say about disrespecting dishonorable people?
Confucius emphasized the importance of respect and courtesy in interpersonal relationships, even towards dishonorable people. In his Analects, Confucius says, when you meet someone of an evil character, you should set a good example and display the utmost respect and courtesy towards them. Do not emulate their behavior, but do not treat them with disrespect either. This suggests that Confucius believed that a person's behavior should not be influenced by the behavior of others, especially those who act dishonorably. Instead, one should strive to set an example of virtuous behavior and treat even the dishonorable with respect and courtesy. This can help to maintain social harmony and encourage others to act with integrity and honor.
Can you cite your sources for that information?
Certainly. Here is the source for the quote. The Analects of Confucius, Book 12, Chapter 2, Verse 1. This is a classic text attributed to Confucius, which consists of a collection of his teachings and sayings compiled by his followers. It is one of the most important texts of Chinese philosophy and has had a profound influence on Chinese culture and society.
Honestly, all I could say to that is, well, damn, why couldn't Google give me that information in the first 5 pages? Thanks, ChatGPT. I'd like to tangent for a minute away from Confucianism specifically and more towards the general study of philosophy. I promise it will connect. Earlier this week, I was watching Young Sheldon on HBO Max, and I came across 2 episodes that I related a lot to this class. And I also thought the people who watch this video would also find similar humorous connections. During season 4, episodes 7 and 8, the titular character, Sheldon Cooper, age 11, begins his first semester at a Texas university. During his first week, Sheldon attends an introduction to philosophy class. His teacher immediately poses some existential epistemology ideas that maybe nothing is real, because maybe we're all just butterflies.
Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi believed it was possible he didn't really know anything because he might just be a butterfly dreaming that he was a philosopher.
Yes, he wasn't a butterfly.
Well, how do you know?
The butterfly brain doesn't contain enough neurons to generate a complex dream. Plus, you referred to him as Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi and not Chinese butterfly Zhuangzi.
You must be Sheldon Cooper.
Yes, ma'am.
Very well, Mr. Cooper. How do you know you're not just dreaming butterflies can't dream?
Because I'm awake.
Or are you dreaming you're awake?
You can see I'm awake and you can hear me talking.
Yeah, I don't know. I saw some pretty trippy stuff at a Grateful Dead concert. The drummer turned into a tap-dancing walrus and floated away, so we can't really trust our senses, can we?
And as you can see, Sheldon has difficulty getting behind this viewpoint.
How can I help you?
I would like to drop your class.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I enjoyed our discussion about skepticism and butterflies.
I'm a scientist and I don't find those types of questions worth my time. And butterflies are just worms that can chase you.
The questions of philosophy are extremely challenging. People have spent 2,000 plus years trying to solve them without success. So if you feel like giving up, I don't blame you.
And when he doesn't win his argument, he pushes back even harder, digging in his heels and deciding to demolish her worldview and prove her wrong. But after reading many different philosophy and science texts, he begins to question everything, which, coupled with a series of confusing dreams, causes Sheldon to accept defeat, but maybe a bit too much, as he slips into his first existential crisis.
All right, what's the problem here?
I don't know what's real.
Well, that's a fun thing to think about on the way to school. Get up and get dressed.
Maybe I'm already dressed. Maybe I'm wearing a zoot suit and spats. That's a shoe covering that's short for spatterdasher. Or is it? There's no way to know.
Here's what I know. I don't have time for this nonsense.
What is time? What is sense? What is?
Sheldon, I mean it.
I remember when things meant things.
All right, I'm gonna count to 3. 1,
Believing in numbers, that takes me back.
2.
To be or not to be, Shakespeare was onto something.
It's your last chance.
Have you ever wondered if you're the tongue of a multidimensional being trying to taste something you can never even understand? I have.
During this, he refuses to get out of bed because if nothing is real, why does it matter? Which is quite a nihilistic viewpoint for an 11-year-old. I bring this up because I felt drawn to this scene, because some of the things we've learned in this class, or I've taken my own time to learn, have caused me moments of this same catatonic fear and confusion, especially when discussing the concept of an afterlife. All faiths and faithless beliefs have differing ideas about what happens when we die, and some of these make me feel comfortable while others make me afraid and cause me to slip into this same confusion and catatonic fear state that Sheldon experienced. In these episodes, he's still questioning everything even after speaking with his mentor and being forced out of bed by one of his biggest fears. Due to this disturbance in his general affect, his Meemaw decides to speak with his professor.
What's this philosophy teacher's name?
Professor Erickson, why?
I might pop in and say hello.
Be careful. She may make you question your most deeply held values.
Meanwhile, Sheldon is disrupting his physics class with behavior like this.
I am times what? Sheldon.
Is it velocity?
Yes. No.
Or is it a velociraptor?
I'm sorry?
Perhaps lambda equals h divided by m times the velociraptor.
All I did was teach him about epistemology.
Whatever it is you're teaching him, it has made him question everything.
That's the goal.
Lady, I had to threaten him with a chicken so he'd put his pants on.
Tasty a brick of cheese is not a number. Why are we still talking about this?
Maybe we're not talking at all.
Okay, that's enough for today.
Not your best lecture.
It's fairly normal for first-time philosophy students to have their worldviews shaken.
Do they snap out of it?
Well, you hope.
I like the answers that the philosophy professor is giving throughout this scene, and I feel really drawn to it, much in the same way I feel drawn to Dr. Glorian's essays and resources. In a scene a few minutes later, Sheldon's physics professor explains that Sheldon's scientific mind doesn't compute or cooperate with these ideas and philosophical notions. And this further reiterates Sheldon's thinking that philosophy isn't as important as physics because he's a man of science after all.
Professor Erickson, I insist that you speak to this young man and explain to him that reality is real and it's possible to know things as fact.
The class is called Introduction to Philosophy. That's what I did.
Well, unintroduce him.
Yes, he's at this school because of his brilliant scientific mind. He spent my last class talking about processed cheese.
And originally I would have agreed with his professor and with Sheldon, but after reading another student's reflection last week, I feel differently. My mind was changed, and I think that that's a harmful viewpoint to have because, like this student explained, combining science and philosophy could mirror and enhance one another, kind of like Taoism and Confucianism. But what do we do when we find ourselves stuck in an existential crisis based on what we're learning in this class? I think the solution can be found not only in these episodes, but also through multiple times in Dr. Glorian's introductions and summaries. When we face our fears head on and confront this confusion with questions, we can then change our viewpoint from what's the point to what is the point?
Hey, how come you didn't want to get out of bed this morning?
If I can't know it's real, what's the point?
You have the right words. You're just saying them wrong. It's not, what's the point? It's, what's the point?
I don't understand.
Asking these questions is exciting. It's what gets me out of bed.
That's interesting. Richard Feynman did say the greatest joy in life is the pleasure of finding things out.
The episode ends with Sheldon realizing, like I hope many of us have, that philosophy and, in general, exploring new ideas and viewpoints is exciting. He gets so excited, in fact, that he nearly changes his major, and in later episodes goes so far as to sample each category of philosophical belief. I wish I was 11 so I had the time to do that. I feel like I'd have my life more figured out. I know this format isn't something I typically do for my final thoughts, but I made these connections before I finished reading Dr. Glorian's essay, and I felt this electric current telling me I just had to share these. So I appreciate you bearing with me and letting me nerd out for a few minutes. Thank you so much for watching my video. This was so much fun to research and to make, and I took so much away from the lessons this week. And I hope this video isn't too long, but I hope I recap, reflected, and explained in a way that is concise but understandable enough for you to learn from. As I've mentioned at the beginning of the video and in every single video, all of my sources are listed below, which you can follow to start your own research. And I highly recommend you check out the videos listed below provided by Dr. Glorian. As always, a huge thank you to Dr. Glorian for allowing me to create assignments that help me better learn, understand, and engage with the course materials. And with that, the video's over. I will see you in 2 weeks after spring break. Bye!